I've sailed the seas and seen good and bad, better and worse, fair weather and foul, provisions running out, knives going and what not. Well, now I tell you, I never seen good come o' goodness yet. Him as strikes first is my fancy. Dead men don't bite. Them's my views. Amen, so be it. The morning sun shone through the big window to the rear of the captain's quarters, and as a beam of sunlight slowly crawled across his face, Greybeard woke up with a start. He could hear the calls of the gulls outside and the sound of busy feet on the deck. The ship sounded like it was a hive of activity. He struggled out of his hammock, dressed himself with the usual difficulty, and took a swig from the bottle of brandy he kept hidden under a loose floorboard. He kept it there, so none of the scoundrels that comprised his crew could drink it. He stowed away his brandy again and headed out onto the deck. There was some organized commotion going on around him as he limped and staggered to the front of the ship. The ship was anchored in calm waters, and looking skyward, he saw that the sails were folded. Standing at the bow and facing out to sea, he saw the tall man in his tricorn hat. The giant was holding a large sack in one hand and a meat cleaver in the other. As Greybeard approached, the giant turned around with a big grin on his face. "Can I go with you? I fixed up some dried meats and biscuits to take with us." While keeping his feet planted, he made little jumping movements with the rest of his body like an excited child, and he waved his arms about to emphasize his pleas. Greybeard shuffled backward a touch to avoid the cleaver that was being swung near his face, and intended to ask what on earth the giant was talking about, but before he could ask, he happened to glance out to the horizon. That's when he noticed the landscape in the distance. It was a beautiful picture of white sands and green foliage under a blue, cloudless sky. Several large, dark hills rose up behind the foliage, and many clusters of tall trees could be seen in between both. "Good God, that's the island!" he exclaimed. "Yeah, I know. We found it last night," the giant said in his booming voice. "We tried telling you, but your door was locked. We was yelling and banging on it for a while, but nothink." Greybeard waved a shushing hand in the big man's face to get him to stop talking. He couldn't believe they'd finally found the damn island, and he had no time for any more chatter. He told the giant to inform the quartermaster, and then stuck up a rowboat. They had an expedition to prepare for. A couple of hours later, their small rowboat hit the sandy shore of the island, and the three men jumped out, carrying with them various items: food rations, waterproofed sacks, cutlasses, pistols, ropes, and shovels. The biggest man carried the most. He had 2 shovels and a large sack strapped on his back, and a long piece of rope wrapped around his left shoulder. He lifted a large hammer in his right hand. "In case we need to smash through some rocks and that," he'd explained to the other 2 men before loading it onto the rowboat along with the rest of their equipment. Eye Patch complained about his boots getting wet while he and the giant dragged the rowboat on to the beach. Greybeard was holding the map and checking the compass he had pulled from his jacket pocket as he tried to get his bearings. "It's this way, lads." He pointed to an area where the green foliage was less dense that led to a group of very tall trees. "At least the forest will provide us some shade," he added, hoping the map was accurate. The sun was high in the sky, and the more they walked, the hotter they would be. A small trickle of sweat ran down his neck, and he wiped his wet brow with the back of his hand before heading off toward the trees. His shipmates followed close behind, stumbling clumsily through the sand, encumbered by the weight and unruliness of the equipment they were carrying. They were soon at the trees, and Eye Patch set down everything he was carrying. He sat leaning against the trunk of a tree, and took several swigs from his leather water skin. The giant leaned against another tree while Greybeard scanned the map, checking his compass and looking for any visible landmarks he could identify. A large red crab running by caught the giant's attention. "Ooh, a crab!" he exclaimed. "I love a nice crab's leg. Let's catch some and cook 'em up." He watched as the crab ran off into the foliage. "Oh, it's gone now," he added. Greybeard eventually identified a landmark he could use. The map contained the scribbled drawings of 2 hills, with a dotted line leading between them. The island also had 2 large hills close to each other, which he could partially see through the tree branches to the northeast. After some complaining about the heat and more talk of cooking crabs, the group were on their way again. The journey to the hills was uneventful, save for Eye Patch tripping over some overgrown tree roots that were poking out of the forest floor. At one point, the giant had taken out various salted and dried meats to pass around, and Eye Patch had done the same with a bottle of rum. Soon they arrived at the foot of the hills. Up close, they seemed more like the size of mountains. A deep and narrow valley stretched out into darkness between them. No sunlight was able to penetrate the vast heights on either side. "I don't like the dark," said the giant. "Did anyone bring a lantern?" Eye Patch opened the sack he was carrying and pulled out 2 lanterns and a tinderbox to light them with. "Here you go," he said, as he handed the giant one of the lanterns before lighting them both. After picking up his equipment again, the 3 men continued into the darkness of the valley. The ground was rocky, and although there were no tree roots to trip over, plenty of rocks provided unstable and precarious footing. Greybeard in particular was struggling and had to use a tree branch that Eye Patch found to steady himself as he walked. "How far is it now?" Eye Patch asked Greybeard, and held his lantern over the map while they took another look. "It's difficult to say because the scale seems to make no sense, but I'd wager it's at least as far as we've come already," Greybeard replied. He thought about how far he'd come from his home in England, how much time had passed since he was a boy, and first set sail on the open sea. A trivial amount, really. He remembered events from his life as a cabin boy, a seaman, a privateer, and finally as an outlaw, all gone now. Such fleeting moments, preserved in time like an insect in amber, like an idea in his mind. Did any of it really matter? Was it all real? "Come on, let's pick up the pace," he said. "There should be an entrance to a mine at the end of this valley, according to the map. We can rest once we get there." The 3 men continued deeper into the valley at as fast a pace as the rocky ground would allow. The bright blue sky turned to dark grey with rain clouds high above, and a distant chorus of frogs were croaking as afternoon headed into evening. Greybeard's suspicions about the scale of the map were proving correct. He estimated that they should have arrived at the entrance to the mine within a couple of hours, 3 at most, but twice that much time had passed, and they still couldn't see hide nor hair of it. "How much longer is this going to take?" Eye Patch grumbled. "As long as it takes," Greybeard snapped. He was as annoyed as Eye Patch, but determined to find the mine entrance no matter how long it took. "I'm hungry," the giant whined. "You're always hungry," Eye Patch responded half-jokingly. The giant ignored the comment, dropped his equipment on the ground, and wandered off towards a pile of large rocks. "I'm going for a piss," he said, as he put his hammer down and leaned it against one of the rocks before disappearing behind them. After a few minutes, the giant emerged, wiping his hands off on his pants. He collected his hammer and made his way back to the other men. Greybeard examined him as he approached and thought maybe he looked a little shorter than he used to, or maybe it was just a trick of the light. "Did I mention I'm hungry?" the giant asked as he picked up his gear. The chirping of crickets joined the frog chorus as the men trudged wearily further into the valley. The giant said he thought he heard an owl, and his stomach was grumbling from lack of sustenance. "Fine, we'll set up camp here," Greybeard instructed them after he relented. He was, after all, himself quite hungry and tired. The map was obviously unreliable, but at the very least he could search more easily if they camped for the night and made use of the daylight in the morning. With the angle of the valley, they would have bright light available at the start of the day, which should make the mine entrance easier to find, if there was a mine at all, of course. Eyepatch busied himself setting up a fire, while the giant eagerly took out the rations he'd brought in order to cook a good meal. "I've got taters, neeps, and some salted beef," he said. Then he took out a large pot from his sack, a ladle, and several wooden bowls. Greybeard spread out his bedroll by the fire and awkwardly lowered himself, using his tree branch for support. His face glowed orange in the heat of the fire, and his nostrils filled with the scent of the giant's broth that was soon cooking upon it. "Eat up," the giant said with enthusiasm as he dished out the broth. Later, with bellies full, the three companions bedded down for the night. Fireflies danced around the pale smoke of the dying campfire as Eyepatch and the giant began to snore. Later, Greybeard drifted off to sleep with the sound of crickets in his ears and hidden treasure in his thoughts.